Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's International Affairs webinar on technology and de-extremization in Xinjiang. My name is Ben Horton, and I'm a communications manager here at Chatham House. Much has been written about the plight of the Uyghur minority in China's Xinjiang province, but less attention has been placed on these systems and processes that have enabled the government's actions. In today's webinar, we'll be exploring the surveillance technologies and security strategies which bolster the PRC's de-extremization policy and consider whether these methods could provide a model for authoritarian regimes beyond China. To discuss all this, I'm delighted to be joined today by two recent contributors to the Chatham House journal, International Affairs, which was recently ranked as the #1 journal publishing work on international relations worldwide. Have to get that plug in there for my boss. So with me today, I have Stephanie Kam, a research associate with the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and Michael Clark, who is a visiting fellow at the Australia-China Relations Institute, which is part of the University of Technology in Sydney. Their co-authored article in International Affairs is titled Securitization, Surveillance and De-extremization in Xinjiang, and it's currently available to download. We will share the link in the chat here. So thank you both of you for joining me and joining us today. So the way this event's going to work, we'll begin with some short opening remarks by both of our speakers before I open up the discussion to our audience for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box below, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you have trouble finding that, please just leave us a note in the chat. Finally, before we begin, let me remind you that this event is on the record. We won't be using the Chatham House rule today. It will be published as a video on the Chatham House website in the coming weeks. And so if you'd like to share your thoughts on social media about this event, please do. Feel free to use our hashtag #CHEvents. So let's kick off then, and I'd like to start with Stephanie, if I could. Perhaps you could give us some background on the history behind the current approach of Chinese security services to Xinjiang.
Sure, thanks very much, Ben. So beginning around 2016 and 2017, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region witnessed a policy change, and this was evident in three key areas. First, there was an emphasis on the collective securitization of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, as opposed to securitization of a segment of the population. Second, the regional authorities also began a process of concentrated and focused ideological and political re-education within an institutional setting. This marked a departure from the reliance on ad hoc de-radicalization strategies through mass propaganda and education that was previously implemented mainly at the grassroots. And third of all, Beijing began imposing tighter restrictions on the transnational movement of Uyghurs, both within China and abroad. The Uyghur diaspora and its transnational social networks were also subject to more intense monitoring. So Beijing's justifications for the increased targeting of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and Kyrgyz ethnic minorities was that its policies in the region were for anti-terrorism, stability maintenance, and de-extremization work, aimed at preventing the radicalization, educating, and rescuing those radicalized from committing terrorist attacks, and therefore designed to treat the symptoms and the root. The reasoning was that re-education as a de-radicalization technique should make the population psychologically and politically resilient to Islamist extremism and terrorism. The focus therefore would be on inoculating a vulnerable segment of the population from becoming radicalized and recruited by terrorist and extremist groups abroad, while counterterrorism strategies focusing on the use of kinetic actions would selectively draw on counterinsurgency principles and Western law enforcement models in combination with Chinese domestic policing principles to suit the local conditions. This would enable the state to thwart terrorist plots on its territory through traditional counterinsurgency tactics and intelligence aimed at militarily degrading terrorist groups' physical existence on its soil. This selective adaptation of Western and Chinese governing practices is not new to Xinjiang. It's consistent with the policy-making approach observed by Sebastian Hillman and Elizabeth Perry in in terms of the wider Chinese context, which emphasizes tailoring policymaking to constantly changing local conditions and adapting particular features of Maoist ideology to ensure the continued resilience of the CCP's one-party rule. So as mentioned by Ben Horton earlier in our recently published paper in May in International Affairs, Michael Clark and I examined the conditions that have given rise to the mass securitization, surveillance, and de-extremization of the Uyghurs. We argue that the current policy witnessed in Xinjiang can be attributed to the convergence of several factors at both the domestic and international level. These include the post-9/11 rise of a surveillance industrial complex in parallel with the absence of a liberal democratic tradition in the Chinese context, the increased willingness of the CCP to experiment with technology as a means for political and social control, and the domestic political developments that have taken place under the leadership of both CCP General Secretary Xi Jinping since late 2012 and Chen Quanguo as Party Secretary of Xinjiang since 2016. So the domestic political developments that occurred under Xi Jinping's core leadership and which provided conditions for the mass securitization, surveillance, and de-extremization include, for instance, the dominance of security officials in the official policy formation agenda in Xinjiang, the downgrading of the State Ethnic Affairs Commission, as well as the State Administration for Religious Affairs, two previously important agencies that played a key role in policy making in Xinjiang in favor of the United Front Work Department of the CCP, the creation of the National Security Commission in November 2013, and the shift in gears at the second Xinjiang Central Work Forum in May 2014, which crucially placed social stability and enduring peace, 社会稳定长治久安, at the forefront of its policy objectives for Xinjiang. This regional policy shift signaled an abandonment of the earlier policy emphasis on economic development. Bit of background here: following the July 5th, 2009 Urumqi riots and the departure of Wang Lequan as Xinjiang's party secretary in 2010, the prevailing policy emphasis under the Hu Jintao administration had been on the accentuation of leapfrog development, or 跨越式发展 of Xinjiang. This emphasis continued throughout Zhang Chunxian's tenure as Xinjiang Party Secretary from 2010 to 2016. The second Xinjiang Central Work Forum held in 2014 therefore signaled an awareness among the Chinese political leadership under the Xi Jinping administration and occurring in the later years of Zhang Chunxian's tenure that the emphasis on economic development in the immediate years after the July 2009 Urumqi riots has simply failed to placate the violence and unrest in the region. So the 2014 Xinjiang Work Forum had also called for, among other things, the closer coordination of Xinjiang policy with both the domestic and international situation, and the designation of Xinjiang as a core region of the Silk Road economic belt. This policy emphasis continued into the appointment of Chen Quanguo as Xinjiang's party secretary in late 2016. Prior to his current appointment, Chen was also party secretary of Tibet from 2011 until late 2016, and was known for his strongman approach to governing the ethnic minority regions. Again, this emphasis on social stability and enduring peace was reaffirmed at the third Xinjiang Central Work Forum held in September last year, albeit with some additions, such as, for instance, the emphasis on firmly casting Chinese collective consciousness as the main line. This shift in policy emphasis in 2014 came in light of continuing violence and unrest in Xinjiang throughout the 2010s, which security officials linked to jihadist militancy networks from abroad. The direct involvement of primarily Uyghurs from Xinjiang traveling to Syria and Iraq to take part in the conflict there, alongside visual propaganda by the transnational terrorist group ISIS, which appeared to feature Uyghur and Han fighters in Syrian propaganda as well, also appeared to amplify this operational threat. But this operational threat was also reinforced at the same time by the co-production of security discourses by the Chinese security establishment and academic scholarship, For instance, in a 2013 interview with the Chinese state media, a counterterrorism academic with the Chinese Institute of Contemporary International Relations had stated that the tactics used by the perpetrators of violence had showed that, quote, East Turkestan's secessionist terrorists had copied the international mode used in Xinjiang, unquote. So this Chinese state's broader social engineering project in Xinjiang has been facilitated by two key developments. First, China has adopted global de-radicalization and counterterrorism strategies in the context of its own fight in Xinjiang against what it refers to as the three forces, namely extremism, separatism, and terrorism. This is reflected in the legalization and institutionalization of the vocational skills education and training centers as a means of de-extremizing Uyghurs. Second, and crucially, the growing interest and popularity by Chinese elites to use technological surveillance to monitor, shape, and control individuals in Chinese society has been complemented by a willingness of the Chinese security bureaucracy to experiment with new technological tools to govern and control its territory and population, including its ethnic minorities. To be sure, the use of technological surveillance tools to govern has much earlier precedents. Intelligence-led policing reforms have been introduced by the CCP in the broader Chinese context from as early as the 2000s in projects such as the Golden Shield, and in more recent years in the form of the social credit system. But what is notable in the case of Xinjiang is the fact that new technologies used in combination with physical monitoring have been used, as we discussed in our article, have been used in the context of the CCP's counterterrorism and de-extremization work. This integration of covert and overt monitoring has occurred by means of digitized surveillance tools such as GPS tracking, voice and facial recognition technologies, machine learning algorithms, and other software and hardware, as well as the continued reliance on other traditional face-to-face surveillance practices. The reliance on data-driven predictive policing network technologies include the integrated joint operations platform, which allows the state to preempt signs of extremist, separatist, or terrorist behavior among the targeted population. As a means of social sorting, such surveillance technologies enables the state to group Uyghurs into different categories according to their proclivities for risk. For instance, according to one report, Uyghurs are grouped according to 4 categories: focus, for investigation, untrustworthy, ordinary, and trustworthy. This technological governance and control of society, as Darren Byler, the anthropologist Darren Byler, who studied Xinjiang as well, has noted, is sustained by a political economy comprising multiple stakeholders, state security, higher education, and private industry collaborators. Moreover, through the introduction of convenience police stations, the Chinese state has been able to embed police officers more deeply at the grassroots level in Xinjiang. The CCP also employs various forms of mass surveillance and informal surveillance and mediation processes at the grassroots to increase its social visibility and penetration and to preempt stability. One such example is the 10 Households Joint Defense, a grassroots unit where households are basically organized and mobilized into a defense unit. Public security agencies, state-owned enterprises, and grassroots agencies also participate in this securitization and surveillance in Xinjiang. On the one hand, such a system functions with the explicit purpose of ensuring public security and maintaining stability in the region. But on the other hand, it is also designed to politically mobilize party cadres to wage a war against the perceived enemies of the state, serving towards party building and reinforcing the CCP's role as an arbiter of stability. So 3 key findings emerge from this discussion. Firstly, the Chinese state has increasingly deployed new technologies as part of its counterterrorism and de-extremization strategies, justifying its usage as a tool to ensure political and social stability in a historically contested and sensitive region. Second, historically rooted ethno-racializing schemes that locate the various ethnicities along a developmental trajectory have emerged in parallel with the specific strategic discourses of deviance and risk under the rubric of counterterrorism. So the reliance on surveillance, stability, and control has now superseded all other policy injunctions in Xinjiang, such as, for instance, the previous policy emphasis on economic development or on ethnic minority integration. As a consequence of this, many Uyghurs are viewed as not only as backward and in need of educating and rescuing, but also as a suspect community whose identities have become securitized as a threat to stability. Third, and this is something that we touch on in our article as well, is that through biopower, which is a mode of bringing life and its mechanisms into the realm of explicit calculations by the state, technological governance as a tool of de-extremization can function towards disciplinary and regulatory ends, working in ways that liberate. However, biopower can give way to the naturalization of violence and dehumanizing processes when its emphasis is on the coercive transformation of individuals. The coercive aspect of biopower is reflected in efforts to normalize Uyghur habits and to modify the extreme and aberrant thought and behavior. This is the intrusive and pernicious dimension of biopower, which Foucault had explicitly cautioned about when he spoke of the potentially exploitative role of disciplinary power by characterizing it as a modest, suspicious power which functions as a calculated but permanent economy. So as new technologies are being employed across liberal and illiberal contexts alike and are used as a tool by states to monitor and surveil the population, as well as to shape individual subjectivity so they act according to precise norms, it will become even more important for researchers to discern and unpack the existence of these complex borrowings and twinnings. Thank you. I look forward to the questions.
Stephanie, thanks so much for that overview. I'd like to turn directly over then to Michael. Michael, thanks very much for joining us as well. I believe you're going to be focusing more on the impact that these policies have had on the target populations and the potential implications beyond China.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks as well, Ben, for the invitation to join tonight, and thanks for Stephanie for that great introductory overview. So I suppose the starting point for what I'll talk about this evening is really leaving off on, I suppose, this notion that Xinjiang is now, you see it described often as a sort of modern dystopian police state. And of course, we do not disagree with that characterization, yet I think one of the key arguments of our paper is essentially we actually need to go beyond that description and to really unpack some of the implications of what that actually means in practice. In particular, the jumping off point that we use in the paper is really some notions of surveillance. So, surveillance obviously is often about social control, but we suggest it's also a much broader set of implications than that. And in particular, and this is something that Stephanie noted as well towards the end of her remarks just now, is that some of the technologies that have been observed and implemented in Xinjiang are highly suggestive of the disciplinary effects of surveillance, and disciplinary in the sense of Foucault and James C. Scott's rendering of that term. So in a sense, it's not just about control, it's about constraining and shaping individual and social behaviour towards particular ends, in this case, the ends of the Chinese party state. So in the article, we find and describe that this surveillance apparatus that's been erected in Xinjiang since 2016 really forms what I would term the central connective tissue, so to speak, that enables the functioning of the re-education system. And I'm going to spend a bit more time just now unpacking what I mean by that. And this is because that if we look at some of the high-tech and also the sort of traditional mass line forms of surveillance that we describe in the article, and other scholars have also described, is that it really allows and permits the Chinese state to engage in what Richard Jenkins terms social sorting. And it allows it to do social sorting on a wide scale. So for Jenkins, he sort of describes social sorting as comprising the identification, ordering of individuals in order to put them in their place within local, national and global institutional orders. So social sorting is a particularly important concept here because of the way in which we framed it is it enables the state to ascribe to individuals or communities particular penalties, constraints and sanctions according to their particular categorisation. And again, Stephanie touched on that as well when she referred to sort of the so-called three types of people, trustworthy, untrustworthy and so on. So the core question then is, how does the state actually determine who fits particular categories? And this is really around, I think, the issue of digging a little bit deeper into the ways in which the high-tech forms of surveillance, but also the traditional mass line forms of surveillance actually operate in Xinjiang. How do they actually identify and categorise individuals? And we argue in the paper that the party state does this, and the security apparatus does this. It identifies and categorises individuals on the basis of a number of measures or criteria, and most important of which is sort of a concept of ideological deviancy in a way, that the state deems to be either precursors or direct manifestations of what it defines as extremisation. That is, expressions or practices of what are sometimes termed the three forces or the three evils: separatism, terrorism, and extremism. And we can see this, how this operates in a number of ways. One is if we look at some of the legislative and regulatory framework set up around this apparatus. So, for instance, the regional government's March 2007 de-extremization regulations. Those regulations reveal the state's objective to categorise and punish individuals on the basis of this conceptualisation of deviancy or abnormality. So, for instance, those regulations map out specific types or what the document refers to as primary expressions of extremist behaviour or thinking, including a wide range of acts, including wearing or compelling others to wear gowns or face coverings, bearing symbols of extremification, spreading religious fanaticism through wearing of irregular beards or name selection, through to things like accessing foreign language media or Arabic media. There's a whole range of specific acts and behaviours that are deemed abnormal and lying within this realm of extremification by the state. So in the paper, we describe and explain a number of ways in which the surveillance apparatus enables social sorting to take place on the basis of those criteria. And we also make the argument in the paper here that this is really central to the operation of the re-education system, and also working towards what we see as its ultimate objective, which is the so-called transformation of Uyghur and other Turkic minorities into quote unquote normal and pliable and productive citizens of the modern Chinese state. So in the paper, we touch on some of the traditional mass line forms of surveillance, such as the visit, benefit and gather and bonding as relatives campaigns, which have sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese Communist Party cadres and officials to visit and homestay, so-called with Uyghur families throughout Xinjiang. And these teams of cadres essentially to monitor and report on day-to-day behaviour of Uyghur communities and Uyghur households to ensure that there is broad compliance with state regulations, but also a number of normative prescriptions about how normal citizens behave in particular circumstances. In the paper, we also turn to the issue of the high-tech surveillance apparatus and I suppose the nuts and bolts of that particular apparatus. And again, Stephanie touched on some of this earlier. So the implementation of the so-called grid-style policing of urban areas with convenience police stations set up along geometrically organised spatial zones for monitoring, the linkage of that grid-style policing to the rollout of new surveillance technologies. In particular, the use of facial recognition and iris scanning technologies at checkpoints, train stations, and so on, through to the collection of biometric data for passports, the downloading of mandatory apps to cleanse smartphones, and so on. And the ways in which this data is, in a sense, hoovered up and aggregated by the IJOP, the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, that is used by Public Security Bureau personnel throughout Xinjiang. And we also describe the ways in which that data is then used to produce actionable intelligence for the Public Security Bureau. There are a range of different examples to draw on here. There is one particular data set that's been obtained by The Intercept earlier this year, around 52 gigabytes of data just from the Urumqi Public Security Bureau, which really details in really a granular form just the pure amount of data that's been generated by the system, and the way that this is then used to flag particular individuals for further investigation, or even to be sent to various forms of re-education and detention. So taken together, this mass line approach and also the technologically enabled surveillance makes it clear that the monitoring of everyday life in Uyghur neighbourhoods is geared to identify and respond to what the Chinese Communist Party has defined as key markers of ideological deviancy. So it's not simply about control, it's also about enabling the state to shape constrained behaviour, but also to produce behaviours. And this is the connection to Stephanie's point earlier about the notion of biopower, that this information is then used to structure individuals in a particular way, whether they're sent to education or various forms of detention or other forms of political indoctrination and education, in order to reshape the ways in which they act within society. So beyond Xinjiang, I think there are a number of important and broader implications that flow from some of the arguments that Steph and I make in the International Affairs article. I think the first one, again, it very specifically relates to Xinjiang, but also to China more broadly. And that is that the system that we describe that has been erected in Xinjiang potentially sets China on the path of becoming what some scholars have termed a responsive tyranny, in which, in particular, new forms of technologies, new digital technologies of surveillance and so on, empower the state to act preemptively and to identify and, in a sense, control and quash opposition in advance before it really germinates into outward displays of opposition on the basis of material data collected by its many forms of mass information collection. And this point actually links, again, and Stephanie noted this earlier as well, connects to wider issues around the social credit system in China and forms of so-called social management that the Chinese Communist Party is engaged in on an ongoing basis. The technological enabled systems of surveillance and control, I think, also intersect with a number of global dynamics in important ways, which also bear further research and further watching. The first is that the utilisation of specific new technological innovations, DNA sequencing, metadata analysis, facial recognition technology, right through to automatic gate recognition, for instance, are becoming increasingly deployed by states throughout the globe, both in the global north and the global south, usually in the name of public safety and or counterterrorism. And this is certainly the way in which the Chinese Communist Party publicly frames what it's doing in Xinjiang. So this trend is important in a number of ways because I think it makes it easier in some ways for the Chinese state to construct a justificatory narrative around what it's doing in Xinjiang. And we've seen this in a number of multilateral contexts. For instance, China's conduct at United Nations Human Rights Commission, for instance, where it has garnered a lot of support from the developing world around this issue of public safety and counterterrorism. Second, the Chinese state's engagement with and prioritisation of surveillance technologies, and this has been quite well documented, has resulted in the increased direct involvement of a number of Chinese and global technological companies in the provision of both technologies and components to the security apparatus, the security state in Xinjiang. And this positive development is something that's been acted upon by a range of states, particularly the United States, through a variety of sanctions, means, and so on. And this is something that hopefully will continue. So just to conclude, while the system of pervasive surveillance, which we describe in the paper, and the practices of re-education in Xinjiang represents, I think, an extreme example of the dystopic potentialities of modern forms of technology, but also some of the modernist ideologies that underpin them. It's the spread and potential normalisation of this surveillance industrial complex that is perhaps more troubling moving forward, that this potentially will spread beyond China's borders.
Michael, thank you very much for that. Yeah, that was very fascinating. We have a few questions coming in. I'd encourage people to add their questions as well as we go. I just wanted to pick up on something that Stephanie mentioned actually initially in her piece, which was around the sort of party building aspects of this social engineering process. I just wondered if you could speak a bit more about that and what the desired end within Xinjiang is. What vision do the PRC have of how the society is going to function after this process that you've been describing?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's an interesting one because I think one of a Chinese scholar that I spoke to mentioned that a lot of the governing practices in Xinjiang is really based on trial and error. And I think, as I mentioned in the earlier part of my presentation as well, a lot of the policy-making approaches that the CCP relies on is really a mesh of adaptation of Western practices and tailoring them to more localized governing practices in the Chinese context. So I think it's hard to know exactly what's going on in the mind of the Chinese leaders. But I think in terms of a threat, certainly there is some kind of a consensus, at least within the Chinese scholar academic establishment, that the current approach has gone a bit overboard in terms of ensuring the stability in the region. So I think that's what we can say for now in terms of the current approach and the end goal of the state in Xinjiang. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Michael, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think just add a couple of points really. I mean, one is, I suppose, to look at the longer term context here that underlies what's been happening in Xinjiang. And again, Stephanie noted some of this earlier as well, in terms of a number of driving assumptions, if you will, of the Chinese Communist Party about what is actually, or what was at the root of what they defined or perceived as instability and even terrorism in Xinjiang over a long period of time. And I think you can isolate a number of factors. One is underdevelopment, in inverted commas, and underdevelopment's been understood in a number of ways, not just purely economical, but also in terms of cultural, social and cultural underdevelopment. So this sort of touches on issues around ethnic identity as well, not just simply whether Uyghurs and other Turkic minorities can achieve greater levels of income and so on. The second issue has to do, I think, with a much more contingent, perhaps, set of circumstances around the July 2009 events in Urumqi, which, in hindsight, seem to have acted as something of a catalyst, I think, for some of this harder line sets of positions whether it was some of the original formulation about the so-called second generation of ethnic minority policy, moving away from these notions of autonomy for ethnic groups throughout China, but specifically in Xinjiang, and also connecting that to notions of, and we touched on this in the paper, really notions of state building in a way. How can the Communist Party make Uyghurs and other Turkic ethnic minorities, can make them Chinese, in inverted commas? And of course, it's a really big question, and has had a number, and the party has over a number of decades attempted to answer that in a variety of different ways. And so in a sense, this is just sort of another step in that development.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. And actually, we have a question that's come in that sort of picks up on this question around this sort of ethnic minority identities point, which is coming from someone anonymous, but thank you for your question. So they're basically asking why the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang is considered a threat to the Chinese Communist Party, in contrast to Muslim minorities in other parts of China, which aren't facing this same sort of process. So they're sort of asking, is this a sort of a question of sort of, as you mentioned, sort of adapting an ethnic minority and trying to make them more Chinese, or is it something to do with the kind of geostrategic sort of position of Xinjiang on the periphery of China, and the need to have control over that particular sort of geographic region? I don't know who would like to go with that first, or whether you both like to have a go at that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have a stab first. I suppose it really is a combination of those things. I mean, if you look at, I suppose it's a question really of what makes Xinjiang and the Uyghur, I suppose, exceptional from the Chinese Communist Party's viewpoint. And I think there is really no avoiding, some of that historical baggage, but also some of the geopolitical baggage, if you will, as well. Going right back to the late 80s and early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the establishment of independent states in Central Asia. That was something that was seen as, this could happen in Xinjiang as well, if the party didn't maintain control in a variety of contexts. But I think what's particularly interesting over the last 4 or 5 years in particular is the way in which a lot of the processes of re-education, but also in particular the official statements around re-education, they are really concerned increasingly, I think, with what you could define as ethnic rather than religious identities. Yes, Islam is important, but it is seen as being really one distinctive characteristic of, in particular, Uyghur identity. And so you have here this question of, okay, well, is it actually the Turkic ethnicity of the Uyghur that is in itself ultimately threatening in some ways to the Chinese Communist Party, and that the process of re-education is really about attempting to break down some of those barriers that the party state sees between the Uyghur and Han Chinese, the dominant Han Chinese culture. And so hence you get a focus on prohibiting various forms of Islam, but also prohibiting the use of Uyghur language, removal of Uyghur children from their parents and guardians and so on. So there's a whole suite of policies here that we can't just say is just about Islam.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Stephanie, did you want to add to that? Or?
Yeah, I think I would agree with Michael's point about the geostrategic reasons that differentiate. And we don't really deal with this as much in the paper, but in a different, in my thesis, I actually go into depth about the reasons for this divergence in terms of the CCP's approach to its ethnic minorities in Xinjiang as opposed to its the other Muslim ethnic minorities in the other parts of China. For instance, like the Uyghurs in Ningxia. But I would say that historical antecedents also play a role in the treatment of Uyghurs, and there are a number of interesting papers that actually deal with this aspect. In particular, Enzi Han and Harris Mylona's 2014 paper and York Frederick's 2018 paper. These papers, they focus on the intersection between ethnic conflict, nationalism, and national security concerns. And they use that to basically explain the sources, the international sources for Chinese policy on the management of the Uyghur population. So I guess I would leave it at that. It's a lot more complicated than these reasons, of course, but I invite you to have a look at those papers if you're interested. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So we have a few more questions coming in now, and I want to try and get to some of them before we finish. So we've got a question here, I'm going to sort of ask them together because they kind of relate to the logistics of how this is being done. So we have a question, again, from an anonymous contributor who wants to know a bit more about how the sort of the time frames that these processes are intended to play out over. So do you think that the surveillance methods and re-education methods that are being employed now are intended to be used over many generations, or is this intended to be a kind of short-term intervention that makes a sort of significant enough change in the population? As far as what you can tell from policy circles, what is the timeline around these processes? And then another one here, which is actually about the technology that's being used itself. So we've got a question from Johannes von Ahlefeldt, who asks, are there any indications that big tech companies from outside China are involved in creating these technologies? If not in Xinjiang, then in other parts of the country, and what are the implications of that? So yeah, what's the timeline and who's involved in actually producing the systems that are being used?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the timeline, look, I mean, I think, yeah, this is something that's quite difficult to really ascertain, I think, except to say that, you know, we've already seen this process underway since 2016. So, you know, we're in well over the sort of 5-year, or thereabouut 5-year mark of the implementation of mass forms of re-education, forms of social control, and high-tech surveillance throughout the region. It seems, I think, from a range of indicators that it's kind of here to stay, I think, certainly as long as Xi Jinping and the current leadership remains the same, I think. If you look at for example, also the role of Chen Qingguo, the Communist Party chairman in Xinjiang as well. I mean, he has been promoted to the Politburo as well. So there's a clear sets of indications that, you know, the policy settings, if you will, sort of been well and truly set in train, as have some of the institutional adaptations. So Stephanie noted as well that in the paper we sort of note the shift between the different roles of state and party bodies in formulating and implementing a policy towards ethnic minority regions. So the shift from the State Ethnic Affairs Commission to the United Front Work Department, for instance, has been a really key one. And that really has stayed the same. So you still have this institutional bedding down, if you will, within the party as well as the bureaucracy, so setting this policy in train. So yeah, it seems to me that it is really a long-term scenario.
Yeah, and I think as long as there are individuals within the establishment that view that this policy is working in terms of successfully de-radicalizing and preventing the threat in the region, the policy will will continue to be sustained. And as I noted, I think briefly in my talk earlier as well, this surveillance industry is not a one-man show. It's also being sustained by a political economy of various other actors, and it would take it. Yeah, basically, it's very interest-driven, so it will not be easily dismantled.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you very much. So I've got a question here. I'd love to hear a bit more of your thoughts. Actually, it seems to be coming in from a number of different people in different ways around the extent to which these technologies and these surveillance systems are likely to be sort of exported abroad, adopted by other countries, applied to different areas. We've got a question that's come in there saying that, do you think that this is something we might see in Hong Kong, but beyond China as well? Do you think that increasingly these methods will be sort of whether China will be a kind of adopted as a model by other regimes, by other authoritarian states, or even non-authoritarian states?
Yeah, look, I think this is a really, really important question, and I think there's kind of two sides to this story. I think one is the technological side. So yes, that's kind of a path of least resistance in some ways, is that you have the ability of a number of Chinese tech startups and so forth that are involved in Xinjiang SenseTime and iFlyTech and a number of others that make particular components. They will and are exporting those technologies to a whole range of different states. I think the bigger question is really the second element, which is, I suppose, the underlying methodology that we hopefully have in part have tried to explain, is how you actually make or marry up the technology with, I suppose, that wider point about surveillance, that it's not just about ensuring control, but it's also about ensuring you can shape behaviour in certain ways. I think that's kind of the really interesting part, and I think that story is perhaps yet to fully emerge. But having said that, I think there is clear avenues for that to be transferred. So, for instance, China has a range of cooperative relationships with the Central Asian states, for instance, through the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation. And also, I think just yesterday I noted there was some reporting about a range of Chinese counter-terrorism experts and so forth that will be travelling to engage with Pakistani partners, for instance, in the wake of a number of the attacks in Pakistan that have appeared to target Chinese nationals. So there are a number of ways in which, you know, that kind of element can potentially be transferred.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Stephanie, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I would just second Michael's point about the normative role of technologies, that they're not inherently good or bad in any case, but it's the kind of the means by which you use technologies whereby they become a concern. And having said that, and I think we touch on this to some extent, which is the kind of the blurring of lines between the blurring of the line between illiberal and liberal practices of governing. I think by paying more attention to some of these governing practices, it enables us to kind of discern the existence of these complex borrowings and twinnings of governing practices, and then that's not something that we can cleanly associate authoritarian regimes or liberal regimes behave in this particular way, and therefore this means that liberal technologies in the hands of liberal regimes are necessarily safer than technologies in the hands of authoritarian regimes. So I think that's something that we need to also pay attention to in light of this broader discussion as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I'm conscious that we're sort of almost 10 minutes over time now, so I think I'm going to bring this to an end. Thank you very much for those of our audience who left questions that we didn't get around to. Apologies for that. I would encourage you to read the paper that we linked earlier, because some of the answers to those questions are absolutely contained there. It's been a really fascinating discussion. Michael, Stephanie, thank you so much for your contributions and for writing with International Affairs. And I will just leave our audience with the reminder that next week we have an event next Wednesday on the struggle for women's rights and gender equality within the UN system. It should be a really fascinating panel discussion, so hope to see you there. The registration link has just been shared in the chat. Okay, until next time, have a lovely evening, have a lovely day wherever you are, and thank you very much for joining us.